What's up? Today, we're going to talk about looping and tempo. Now, this is a continuation of a previous video series that I'm doing talking about how to DJ on USBs. If you go back, I've done a plethora of videos pretty much covering every section of the mixer. There's only like one or two other portions I need to cover. And my goal of the whole series is to kind of just cut through the fluff and kind of give you guys what I use when I DJ a lot of the times, especially from like the basics, like the ground up. I mean, everyone has a different style of DJing, and that's what makes it cool, obviously, is you can go somewhere and there's a ton of different styles and different ways that people DJ. But this is coming from someone who's been DJing for, like
a few moments later,
8 years now, and full time for 4 to 5. So I've done every single type of event you could possibly think of. And with that, I've learned there's some parts of the mixer that you use a lot more than others. So today, we're going to cover those two parts, the looping, which is very important, and the tempo, which is also extremely important. Okay, so we are in front of the mixer now, and the parts that you're going to see me use are this top section up here. That is where a lot of your, or almost all actually, of your looping commands are going to be. And then on any mixer, typically, this is going to be how you adjust your tempo, this tempo meter right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start with tempo, then hop over to loops, just so it makes a little bit more sense, I think, structurally. I think tempo is like a kind of like lays the groundwork for a lot of your success, just like EQing and other things of that nature. I think tempo is extremely important because when you're DJing, 99% of the time, you want the tempos to match because that's how you have a good transition. On any sort of like record box based device or turntable, you have this slider here. It's pretty much 3 buttons you're going to use and this slider here. So it's kind of going to probably be out of focus, but this number is adjusting up here. That's because I am adjusting the tempo. And there's the tempo reset button, which I usually do not use. If you need to snap back to the tempo really quick, like let's say I have it all the way up here, and this track's actually, I think, 128, but I have it bumped up to like 140 right now. If I hit the tempo reset, it's gonna jump it immediately back to the initial tempo of the song, which is 128. So that's a cool trick if you're trying to really adjust something quick and you're trying to do like a tempo change. But I typically am never really using this button. I am using these 2 buttons though. I check these buttons pretty much every time if I'm walking into a new space and have never like DJ'd on their stuff before. You can see this on CDJs, almost every model, XDJ, all that stuff they have something called the master tempo button. I always have this on, always, because what this does is pretty much like a key lock function. That's what it is. So if I play this track and start increasing the tempo, you see how it started to fluctuate in terms of the tone. It'll start to pitch it up the higher up you go, and it'll start to pitch it down the lower you go on the tempo. So master tempo, you always want this red button on, especially if you're, unless it's an intentional kind of transposition that you're doing, you are always, and I repeat, let me look at the other camera for this, always have this button on. And the other one up here is the tempo percentages button. So there's 4 different percentages you can do. You can either do +6%, +10, +16, or you can do wide. So what that means is it is essentially just a percentage of how much the fader is going to adjust the tempo, how sensitive it's pretty much going to be. So +6 only operates within +6% or -6%. So typically that will only give you about like 9 dB of a change, nothing crazy. So it's like fine if you're DJing like house and stuff like that, or any sort of genre that keeps you kind of locked into a tempo. But if you're DJing hip hop and stuff like that, you won't even really use 10 either. You'll probably either use 16 or wide. Wide is like crazy drastic. Wide will take you all the way down to 0. Like literally the track won't even start. So wide, if you're doing some crazy kind of like finishing out, like it literally will double the tempo of this song if you put it on wide. Like I can boost it by 100%, which doubles the tempo of the song. But usually I settle around the plus 16 mark. It's a good level of control, gives you really good range, and it's not anything too drastic. And that's pretty much it when it comes to tempo. There's really nothing else to go over with that other than just the common heuristic, whereas like if this track's in 128.5, right? You want the track you're transitioning into to also be 128.5, because when things are in the same tempo, then you can put them over top of each other and then transition out one and into the next song. And now onto one of my favorite sections, and that is the looping section. Now, you can see there's these two yellow buttons kind of blinking up here. You can manually set a loop with these two buttons. You can also set a 4-beat loop or an 8-beat loop with this button down here. This is the slip button. You don't really need that. Slip is basically like, it basically will keep count for you. So like if I spin it back, it'll snap on the same count. So that's cool if you're trying to really stay on and it's kind of like a safety measure. Like if you accidentally touch the wheel or something like that. I mean, that is a cool thing to have on. But if I'm looping and stuff like that, I never have slip on, to be honest, especially when I'm using loops. But if there's a cool way that you guys use slip, definitely let me know. I would be very interested. So if there's a cool way you use...
Words are hard today.
If there's a cool way you use slip, let me know down below in the comments. But when it comes to making loops here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set a intro loop. And what I'm going to do is I will set a manual loop first so you guys can see how I do that. And then I will show you how to like enter and exit out of that loop. I'll also show you how I use this loop cutter here. I tend to lean more on the loop cutter, as well as creating my own loop cues within like these record box devices. When you're actually setting a cue manually, you'll tap the yellow button for in and for out. Now, if you go longer than like 32 bars, or I mean, shorter than that, if you go longer than like 8, the button will kind of just stop. This is used for like really fast and sudden, like niche loops that I'm using. Like if I'm holding a long part of a song and then using the crossfader to really chop into the next song, that's the only time I'm really using these cue points, or these, not cue points, these looping buttons. That's the only time I'm really going to use them. It messed me up because it says in cue right here. But if I was to make like a 2-count cue, it would just be... And let's say you wanted to make that cue longer or shorter. That's what these call buttons are. You can make the loop longer that way, or you can make it really short. But I personally like to use the loop cutter button. That's something that I tend to lean into a lot when I'm DJing, because it, instead of having to manually set it, if you just hit it once, it'll automatically set a 4-count loop for you. And this minus sign, that basically just means hold down. If you hold down the loop cutter, that will make an 8-beat loop instead of a 4-beat how I do it. Now I'm just going to exit this loop, and then I'm going to hold down again to set an 8-beat loop. And that's, I mean, you can also use the call buttons on that as well. You can make it longer. So you can use the call buttons as well with this. So typically, like I said, if I'm doing something super short, really fast, abrupt, I'm using these buttons here to set the loop. But I'm typically using the loop cutter and then using my call buttons to make adjustments as I see fit. Now, the last thing I'm going to leave you guys with is setting your cues on the actual hardware itself. There is a way to set your own cues, which I did in a previous video on exporting your first USB and record box. And that should be actually one of the most viewed videos we have on here. I should probably do a more advanced one for you guys for like the export settings and stuff like that. But there is a way that I show in that video how to make like preset loops. And that's how you make your preset loops to where like when the song gets to that point, the loop will automatically trigger. So in that video, there's some tips in there on how to make those preset loops. But let's say you're kind of DJing on the fly here and you want to make one of those preset loops, but you don't have the capability of doing that because you forgot to do it beforehand. What you do is you will then make a loop, and then you will then use the pads down here to set a cue point. Okay, so I have a 4 count loop going right here. And let's say I'm going to bring this track in later or something like that, or I'm about to bring it in, but I want that loop to be there for me at some point. All you have to do is set the loop and then make a cue point just by hitting the pad down here. So you saw once I hit that pad there's like a little, probably hard to see, but there's a little letter that came up for the letter D, which is the 4th cue point here. And what happens is when I now hit that cue point, it's not green, it's yellow. So when I hit that cue point, it'll start that 4 count loop for me immediately. So let me just jump to a different part in the song, and then I will jump back to that loop. So I'm gonna jump back. And the loop's already there for you. That's what's great about it, is you can set these in advance too. So as soon as you hit that cue, that loop is going. And if you want to get out of that loop, you just hold your reloop exit button down here, or up there, I guess. Up, yeah. And then that will take you out of the loop. But that does it for me today. Hopefully you guys learned something new. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, all of that good stuff. And be on the lookout for the next video where I go over the pad section in specific. And we're going to go over like the hot cues, the beat loops, all the different things that you can do within the pads that are designed, as well as some of the cue point stuff within the record box devices itself.